Lecture 6, Job.
Welcome back to Lecture 6, which will conclude our treatment of the Hebrew Scriptures by considering one of the most remarkable books of the Bible, the book of Job. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the challenge that Job offers to the Deuteronomistic theology and also discuss some of the compositional and translational problems in the book of Job. Now, the Deuteronomistic theology, as I've talked about in the past 2 lectures, assumes that God rewards good actions and punishes evil ones, and that we can see this at work in the world around us. There are several implications to this view of the world, the way the world works. It implies, first off, that anyone who is flourishing, anyone who is fortunate and doing well, must be a righteous person, and therefore good fortune of any kind, wealth, children, possessions, power, can be seen as evidence of one's righteousness. Conversely, and perhaps more importantly, the view of the world implied by the Deuteronomistic theology is that anyone who is suffering must have done something wrong, even if no one knows about it. Their suffering is in itself evidence that they have done something wrong. Now, this view is one that many people find comforting, and it is very, very long-standing. There are many adherents to it today, probably in most cultures, but it does not, at least it seems to me, ultimately address the complexity of the world as we observe it, or at least the apparent complexity of the world as we think we observe it. I think that most of us would say it's obvious that there are times when evil people do not suffer, or at least don't seem to suffer appropriately. When I'm talking to students about this kind of thing, my favorite example of that is the fact that Pol Pot died in his bed surrounded by his family. There are times when evil people do not suffer, and perhaps more deeply troubling, there are times when good people clearly do suffer. And for a believer in an all-powerful God, a God who is by definition all-powerful, and is also by definition righteous, this raises a very large question, or a very big problem, often referred to as the question of theodicy. That comes from 2 Greek words meaning God and justice. The apparent existence of undeserved suffering in this world raises the question of the justice of God, the question of theodicy. If God is both righteous and all-powerful, why does he allow good people to suffer? If you have a God who is not righteous, if you have an evil God, it isn't a problem. If you have a God who is not himself all-powerful, it isn't a problem. But if you posit a God who is both all-powerful and by definition righteous, then you do have a problem with the apparent undeserved suffering of good people. And thinkers from antiquity onward have grappled with this question and undoubtedly will continue to. I doubt that it's likely ever to be fully resolved. Possible answers to the question of theodicy have ranged from denying the reality of evil and suffering. This was more or less a position taken by the Stoics. For instance, the Roman author Seneca, one of those authors on whom I wish I could give you a lecture, but we did not have time to fit him in. The Roman author Seneca says that it is by definition impossible that any evil can ever befall a good man. So if something befalls a good man that appears to be evil, it isn't really. It's just an appearance. No evil can possibly befall a good man. So that's one way around the problem. Deny the existence of evil, or deny the reality of evil, at least as it applies to good people. I don't think most of us in the depth of suffering would find that terribly comforting ourselves, to be told this is only an illusion, you're not really suffering. But that is one possible answer to the problem. Answers have ranged all the way from that, denying the existence of evil, to the Gnostic view that the creator of the material world was in fact himself evil. That yes, good people suffer terrible things in this world, and that's because the world itself was created by a malignant force. So those are sort of the 2 opposite extremes of ways to approach this question. There is no such thing as evil, or the creator of the world is not good. Other possible answers include saying that suffering is a test for good people, that it allows us a chance to expand our own souls, to expand our reactions in adversity, or one very common way of getting around this problem, of course, is to move it forward by which I mean to posit an afterlife, and to say that the good will be rewarded in the afterlife and the evil will be punished in the afterlife, so that apparent injustice is only apparent because we're stopping too soon. The whole story hasn't been told yet. So my example, for instance, of Pol Pot dying in bed would be answered by saying, well, he will be punished later on. It just hasn't happened in this world. Other approaches recognize the problem and say that, in effect, there simply isn't an answer. This is a datum of the world in which we live. We can't figure it out. If you accept that there is an all-powerful and righteous God, and you also accept that undeserved suffering, and for that matter, undeserved good fortune do occur, you may just have to say there's something here that we don't understand and leave it at that. The book of Job confronts these problems, the problems of theodicy, head on, but certainly offers no simple answers. The basic plot line of Job is quite simple. In fact, the book seems to be constructed around a fairly simple folk tale. It revolves around the utterly undeserved suffering of an undeniably good man. The book of Job suggests that Job's suffering began as a test of his righteousness. The opening of the book states that Job is, without question, righteous and pious, as well as being very fortunate. He's wealthy, he has a large family of flourishing children, he's respected, he's happy, he's doing very, very well. But the book says, without question, that he is also righteous and pious. So that's a given. That's where we start the story. Hasatan, the accuser, this is where we get the word Satan from, but in the book of Job, Satan, Hasatan, is not the devil. The word means the accuser. He seems to be a member of the heavenly court, and he persuades God that if Job is tested, Job will cease to be pious. In other words, Satan says, sure, he's pious now. Look at everything you've given him. It's easy for him to be pious and to be righteous because everything's going well for him. Let me take away all his blessings. Let me take away everything that makes his life so good, and then we'll see how pious he will be. And God gives Satan permission to test Job to see what the outcome will be. In a horrific crescendo of disasters, Satan inflicts a whole series of sufferings on Job. First, Job loses all his possessions. He loses his wealth, he loses his flocks, he loses all his possessions. Then his children are all killed. When a wind comes and blows down the building in which they are, all his children die. In each of these instances, Job is told about this by a messenger, someone who comes to tell him the terrible thing that has befallen Job, and ends up saying, I alone have escaped alive to tell you, a kind of haunting refrain there. I'm the only survivor, and I'm here to tell you what's happened to you. Finally, after losing all his wealth, all his possessions, all his children, Job is attacked in his own person. He's afflicted with a terrible skin disease. So he's left sitting quite literally on a heap of dirt, no possessions, no children, suffering terrible physical agony in his own body. Throughout all these tribulations, Job remains steadfast in his faith, even when his own wife advises him to curse God and die. Job remains steadfast. Now, Job is perhaps most famous for the phrase, the patience of Job, which is a traditional translation of a phrase in the New Testament in the book of James, chapter 5, verse 11. But actually, the Greek word that James uses there, hupomone, would be better translated endurance or steadfastness rather than patience. Patience, at least in modern English, doesn't have quite the right resonance to it anymore. What the word means is the endurance of Job, the steadfastness of Job. Despite all these terrible things that happened to him, Job remains pious and does not lose his righteousness or his faith in God. Finally, in a coda to the book, after Satan has done everything he can, God rewards Job by giving him new wealth, his health again, and a new set of children. I always ask my students if this is really a happy ending or not. When I was teaching this text last fall, for instance, I said to them, now if you died and your parents were given a new child, do you really think it would be okay if you said, oh, well, that's all right then. I've got another one, so it's a happy ending. It seems to be meant as a happy ending. This is part of what I said by what I meant by saying that Job seems to be based on a folk tale, this testing, steadfastness, endurance, and then reward at the end by getting more than he had before. It sounds very much like a folk tale. And certainly, the end of the book of Job does seem to validate the viewpoint of the Deuteronomistic theology, at least to some extent. Job is righteous, remains righteous, and ends up being rewarded by getting even more than he had before. But the end does not answer many of the questions that are raised earlier in the book. And in the middle of the book, in the longest segment of the book, the focus changes from the testing of Job by Satan to Job's own questioning of the reason and justification of the evil that he's suffering. This section of the book is the most fascinating and also the most complicated. Job is sitting, suffering from his skin disease, sorrowing over his lost children, and he's visited by three friends who are often called his comforters, but the comfort they offer him, it seems to me, falls fairly wide of the mark. The three friends come up to Job, and when they first see him, they don't recognize him. He's so filthy and tattered and so disfigured by his disease that at first they don't even know who he is. Then they sit beside him for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking. That's probably the most comforting thing they do. They simply sit beside him, give him the comfort of their presence. After their 7 days of silence, however, the friends each speak to Job, and each one offers his own opinion about why Job is suffering these torments. The first friend, Eliphaz the Temanite, says that Job's suffering is an indication that everyone, even Job, is guilty of some sin. So he takes the viewpoint that the fact that you are suffering means you're guilty of something. He says, "Think now, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off?" And he adds, "As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." He does suggest that Job's suffering will end because Job is a relatively righteous man, but he says, even you have sinned in some way or another. The second friend, Bildad the Shuhite, suggests that Job's children must have been wicked to bring destruction upon themselves. At least he does admit that the children have a point of view. As so often happens in this kind of folk tale or fairy tale, the death of the children is seen simply as a punishment to the parent. Think of David and Bathsheba's baby dying. What did the baby do? Nothing. The baby's death was punishment to his parents or to his father. Bildad at least admits that the children might want some say in this themselves. He says they must have been wicked, or God would not have destroyed them. He asks, does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. So that's Bildad's comfort, if you want to call it that. And he suggests that if Job himself is indeed innocent, then God will rescue Job. So you've got nothing to worry about. If you really are righteous, God will rescue you. And your children deserved what happened to them. The third friend, Zophar the Naamathite, claims that Job must be a sinner. So he goes back to the idea of Eliphaz the Temanite, but states it even more strongly. He says, Zophar says, that Job must be a sinner and that his suffering is, in fact, indeed, evidence that he deserves to suffer. He tells Job, "For you say, my conduct is pure and I am clean in God's sight. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves." And Zophar advises Job to admit his sin. Whatever it is you've done, you must know it, admit it, and then perhaps God will stop punishing you. So all three friends, comforters so-called, adhere to the Deuteronomistic theology. They take Job's suffering as undeniable evidence that he, or at the very least his children, must be guilty of some terrible sin. Because in their worldview, God punishes only the sinful, therefore, the existence of punishment is evidence for sin. Job doesn't buy this. He doesn't accept their presentation of his situation. He says it's not his place to judge God, and he certainly remains loyal to God, but he also maintains his awareness of and insistence upon his own innocence as he answers each of his comforters. He is not aware of any sin that brought this down upon him, and he refuses to accept the idea that he must have done something to deserve it. The final comforter to visit Job is a young man named Elihu, who is angry at Job for attempting to argue with God, and angry at Job's three friends for failing to answer Job properly. Elihu starts by rebuking Job for questioning God's justice. He says that is in itself a sin. God has inflicted this upon you for whatever reason. You dare to question the justice of it. There you go. There's a sin for you right there. In Elihu's view, no human can be truly righteous or truly innocent. That's impossible. And suffering is a form of discipline that God uses to teach human beings. So Elihu's recommendation is that Job, and everyone for that matter, should submit to God. Now, by the way, many scholars think that this section in which Elihu tries to answer Job's objections is a late addition to the original text, that it was grafted in after an earlier version in which we had just the three comforters, and then someone wanted to answer a few more points, make a few more objections, and wrote in this visit by the young man Elihu. Job remains uncomforted. He doesn't and can't accept that he's sinful in some way unknown to himself. And in his responses to his comforters, he calls out to and challenges God. Job wants an explanation for his suffering, and he challenges God using legal terminology. In effect, he wants to bring his case into court, and he wants to force God to defend his own position. He wants to put God on the stand and say, why are you doing this? And ask for an explanation. And finally, immediately after Elihu's speech, God appears and does, in fact, respond to Job, although he doesn't really answer Job's questions directly. God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind in a series of rhetorical questions. He starts out in one of the most famous passages of the book of Job. God starts out by asking Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? How can you expect to understand the way the world works, the way creation works? Were you there? Did you do it? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? And God goes on to mention many of the marvels and wonders of creation, Leviathan, the great monster of the deep, many other elements of creation, and points out to Job, you weren't there, you weren't responsible for any of these things. How dare you question? Seems to be the overall implication there. Now, interestingly, God does not mention the testing aspect of Job's sufferings. God does not say, I'm doing this to test you, to see if you're righteous. God does not say, I'm sending this as a kind of discipline against you. As Elihu said, St. Augustine, whom we'll meet in Lecture 24, says that this is the reason for Job's sufferings, that they were sent to test him and to discipline him. But God does not say so. God simply asks these rhetorical questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? And so God seems then to ratify Elihu's contention, or to agree with Elihu's contention, that humans are simply too small, too limited to dispute the ways of creation. Now, that's a very valid point in and of itself, that human beings probably cannot, using their own reason, understand the nature of the universe entirely, the way the universe works, understand the process of creation. However, it seems, at least to me, that as an explanation of the existence of undeserved suffering, this leaves many questions unanswered. In fact, it seems to me that God is not responding to the question Job asked at all, but to an entirely different issue. Can human beings understand the nature of creation? No, we can't. But that's not what Job asked. Job asked, why am I suffering when I have done nothing wrong, given that you are by definition an all-powerful and righteous God? And the statement that humans cannot understand the complexity of creation really doesn't address that issue. It really doesn't address the problem of theodicy at all. If God is just, why does undeserved suffering occur? Now, if God is implying that he himself was somehow bound by the rules of creation, if he's saying this is simply the way the world is, it's built into the system, people sometimes suffer even though they don't deserve to suffer, that's just how the world in which we live works, fine as far as it goes. But if God is implying that he himself was somehow bound by rules of creation, which makes suffering inevitable even when it's not deserved, then what has just happened to the omnipotence of God? If God is all-powerful and omnipotent, he can't be bound by rules of creation. He made the rules of creation. So it really doesn't work to say, well, this is just the way the universe has to function, because what Job is asking is, why? If you're omnipotent, if you could have designed any universe you wanted, why did you design one in which humans sometimes have to suffer even when they don't deserve it? So if God's implying that he himself was bound by some set of rules and that creation could not proceed in any other way, then God is no longer omnipotent. And so the problem remains exactly the same. If God is all-powerful and permits undeserved suffering, he isn't just. If God is just but cannot prevent undeserved suffering, he isn't all-powerful. The problem of how do you explain undeserved suffering if you have a God who is both all-powerful and just remains exactly where it was, unanswered. Archibald MacLeish, the playwright, summed this dilemma up powerfully in his wonderful play, J.B., which is a modern reworking of the Job story. He has a character say, "I heard upon his dry dung heap that man cry out who cannot sleep. If God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God." A very neat summation of the problem. If God is God, i.e., if God is omnipotent, all-powerful, could have created a universe in which the righteous did not suffer. If God is God, he is not good. If God is good, that is, if he is just and can't stop undeserved suffering, he is not God. He is not all-powerful. So if God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. I read that play the first time when I was 20, and that line has stayed with me ever since. The book of Job, then, is one of the most powerful discussions of the problems of theodicy, the problems of why it is that the righteous suffer undeservedly. And of course, you can expand that to why it is that small children suffer undeservedly, why it is that those who are completely innocent. Okay, you could take Elihu's position that any adult human being is guilty of something, so maybe we all deserve to suffer, but what about a 2 or 3-year-old who dies from some painful disease? How did that person deserve suffering? Job, the book of Job, offers us one of the most powerful discussions of the problems of theodicy, but it ultimately offers no explanation, no real answer. In effect, it simply seems to say there isn't any point in asking these questions, or there isn't any point in expecting answers to these questions. Now, any discussion of the book of Job has to take into account the compositional and textual difficulties of this work. The book's author is anonymous. We don't even have a name associated with the author. Unlike the prophets or unlike the so-called 5 books of Moses, we don't even have a name traditionally associated with this book. We don't know who wrote it. And its date of composition is debated. This is starting to be a rather common refrain in this course. We don't know exactly when it was written, and it looks like it was written in several different stages over a period of some centuries. Most scholars would date the bulk of the book of Job to between the 7th and 4th centuries BC, which is a pretty wide window right there, somewhere in those 300 years. But the final form of the text seems to imply a very complex history of composition. Job reads very much as though the philosophical and theological discussions of the middle section have been grafted into a folk tale that's the framing story. The folk tale I mentioned earlier, in which you have this righteous man, Ha-Satan, the accuser, says to God, "Let me take away everything that makes him fortunate, and then we'll see how righteous he remains. We'll see if he remains pious when I've taken everything away from him." God says, "Okay, do your worst." The righteous man remains pious, and God rewards him at the end. That seems to be the basic folktale out of which Job is built. In the middle, we have grafted in this extremely complex and sophisticated philosophical and theological discussions of the problem of undeserved suffering. And so the general assumption is that the folktale came first, and later someone grafted into that the whole discussion of theodicy, the whole discussion of undeserved suffering. This supposition is supported by differences in style between the framing narrative, the so-called folktale narrative, and the theological discussion. The framing narrative, Satan talking to God, saying, let me test him, the messenger bringing Job the stories of the disasters that have befallen him, and I alone have escaped alive to tell you, and at the end, Job being rewarded with more possessions and a new set of children. All of that is in simple prose, simple, straightforward prose. The middle section features dialogues in poetic style. So even stylistically, it looks as though the middle section has been grafted into a bigger framing story. And Elihu's speeches show distinctive style and vocabulary yet again, even within the middle section, which underlines or supports the idea that perhaps that was added last of all. Now, this could indicate multiple authors of the text working at different times, one author working from many sources, drawing on the sources that he had and compiling them, or a text that's been redacted or edited several times. Just to make things even a bit more complicated, the text of the book of Job not only shows various levels of composition, but it also reflects possible sources in other ancient cultures. There's a document often referred to as the Babylonian Theodicy, from around 1100 or 1000 BC, which features an anonymous sufferer and his friend sitting together and discussing the injustices of life, a conversation very much like the conversation between Job and his comforters, where someone who is suffering dreadfully has a friend sit with him and they talk about why it is that this has happened. The descriptions of Behemoth and Leviathan in chapters 40 through 41 are often compared to Egyptian imagery from the myths of Horus and Seth. So behind the text that we think was compiled somewhere around the 4th century or thereabouts BC, there may be much, much earlier works, earlier traditions coming in from other cultures. And beyond that, the text of the book of Job is rife with difficulties of reading and of understanding. And unfortunately, these affect some of the more important passages in the text. Just to give you a couple of quick examples. Chapter 13, verse 15 is traditionally rendered, though he kill me or though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job talking about God, though he kill me, yet will I trust in him. That's the standard traditional translation of that verse, and that's what most people know as Job's most ringing assertion of faith and trust in God. However, equally plausible translations are, as given by the New Oxford Annotated Bible, see, he will kill me, I have no hope. Or the scholar Robert Gordis, who's done a translation of Job, says, yes, he may slay me, I shall not be quiet. So, what is the final clause there? Yet I will trust in him, I have no hope, I shall not be quiet. Those three readings make a very, very great difference, and depending on which translation you follow, you get a very different impression of what Job is saying here. And apparently all three are equally plausible, equally valid readings of a very difficult Hebrew passage there. Similarly, with chapter 19, verses 25 through 26. This again was picked up by Handel in the Messiah, and this again is an extraordinarily important verse for later Christian writers. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been thus destroyed, or in the King James translation, though worms destroy my body, then in my flesh I shall see God. In Christian theology, this, of course, is taken as a statement about the resurrection. I know that my Redeemer lives. He will stand upon the earth at the last day, and after my body has been destroyed, in my flesh I shall see God. But the note to these verses in the New Oxford Annotated Bible comments that Redeemer could also be translated vindicator, that instead of in my flesh, we should perhaps read without my flesh. So there goes the resurrection of the body, and that the meaning of the Hebrew traditionally translated, I shall see God, is obscure, is uncertain. So I know that my Redeemer lives, and in my flesh I shall see God. I know that my Vindicator lives, and without my flesh I shall see God. Two very different translations. Robert Gordis, the scholar I mentioned a couple of moments ago, who's done a translation of Job and a commentary on Job, has written a great bit about Job, renders these verses as, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, though he be the last to arise upon earth." Not at the last he shall arise, but though he be the last to arise upon earth. "Deep in my skin this has been marked, and in my very flesh do I see God." Not, though my body shall be destroyed, I shall see God, but this has been marked in my flesh right now, and right now in the midst of my suffering, I see God. Again, a very, very different interpretation of a crucial passage. And so the book of Job, like the deep, which it describes in God's words to Job, does not render up its secrets to us easily. So in this lecture, we finished our look at the Hebrew Scriptures. In the next two lectures, we'll turn to Greek culture and Greek literature and talk about the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey.